The air in Damascus smells of jasmine and diesel. It is March 2011, and the city is alive in the way only ancient cities can be. Layered, contradictory, breathing with 10,000 years of memory beneath its skin. A street vendor on Al-Hamidiyya calls out the price of figs in a voice that carries over the morning crowd, his cart stacked high with produce the color of sunrise. A schoolboy in a pressed white shirt chases a football across a stone courtyard, laughing at something his friend whispered. An old man sits at the edge of a fountain, drawing slow circles in the water with his finger, saying nothing, watching the pigeons scatter and return. A woman hangs laundry from a wrought iron balcony, humming. Traffic honks somewhere below. A radio murmurs through an open window, news from somewhere else, someone else's trouble. This is the Syria that most of the world never saw. Not the Syria that would come later. The Syria of rubble and smoke and columns of refugees stretching to the horizon, but this Syria. Warm. Imperfect. Real. A country of 22 million people who woke up that morning and made tea and argued about football and worried about school fees. A country that, in just a few weeks, would begin to tear itself apart in ways that no one, not its government, not its opposition, not the foreign powers who would eventually pour in from every direction, could fully control or predict or stop. But something is already stirring beneath the surface. If you had walked through the old city that March morning and listened closely, not to the vendors or the schoolboys, but to the spaces between words, to the careful pauses when someone changed the subject, to the slight tension in the shoulders of a man reading a newspaper outside a cafe, you might have sensed it. A country holding its breath. In a southern city called Daraa, the breath is about to run out. Daraa sits near the Jordanian border, in the fertile Hauran plain, a place of farmers and merchants and extended tribal clans whose loyalties stretch back generations. It is not a city accustomed to making history. But history, as it often does, arrives uninvited. In late February, a group of teenagers, the oldest barely 17, spray-painted words on a school wall. The words came from Tunisia, from Egypt, from the Arab Spring already sweeping through the region like a fever. The people want the fall of the regime. They used red paint. They probably thought it was thrilling and dangerous and perhaps a little bit foolish. They had no idea what they had started. The security forces, the Mukhabarat, Syria's feared intelligence apparatus, arrested the teenagers within days. What happened next inside the detention cells is not something that can be shown. But it can be inferred from what came after, from the screams that the families said they heard, from the broken fingers, from the words of one father who reportedly asked an official for his son's release and was told, with a calm that was more frightening than rage, "Forget your son. Go make another one." Whether those words were spoken exactly that way no longer matters. What matters is that they spread. And in a culture built on family honor and tribal loyalty, they landed like a match dropped into dry grass. By mid-March, thousands of people were gathering in Daraa's Al-Omari Mosque. Not yet a protest, more like a vigil, a collective holding of grief and fury. Then they moved into the streets. Then the security forces moved in. And then, what you just witnessed in your imagination, that eruption on a dusty street in southern Syria, was not, by any historical measure, an extraordinary event. Governments had been suppressing protests for decades across the Arab world. Police had fired into crowds before. People had died before. The machinery of the authoritarian state was well practiced, well-oiled. But something about March 2011 was different. Something about this particular moment in this particular country would refuse to be contained. The question that haunted everyone who lived through what followed, and haunts historians still, is deceptively simple. Why? Why did Syria descend where others did not? Why did a crackdown that might have lasted days or weeks spiral instead into one of the most catastrophic conflicts of the 21st century? The answer, like all true answers to questions about war, is not a single thing. It is a knot of things, tied together over decades, and in March 2011 that knot finally pulled tight. To understand the knot, you have to go back further than 2011. You have to go back to 1970, when a young Air Force officer named Hafez al-Assad seized power in a coup so swift and precise that it was over before most Syrians had registered it was happening. Hafez was from the Alawite minority, a sect that made up perhaps 12% of Syria's population, and his rise to power had always carried a sectarian undercurrent, even when it was officially denied. He built a state apparatus designed, above all, for survival. The security services multiplied and overlapped, watching each other as much as they watched the population. Dissent was not merely punished, it was made to feel impossible, shameful, dangerous even to contemplate. When Hafez died in 2000 and his son Bashar inherited the presidency, there was a brief, almost touching moment of hope. Bashar was an ophthalmologist who had studied in London, who drove his own car through Damascus without a motorcade, who seemed, to those who wanted to believe it, like a modernizer, a reformer, a man who understood that the 21st century required a different kind of governance. There was even a name for this hope, the Damascus Spring, a period of cultural and political debate that flickered to life in salons and coffeehouses and open letters published by daring intellectuals. It lasted about 18 months before the old machinery reasserted itself and the debaters found themselves in prison. But the hope never entirely died. It went underground. It fermented. And when the Arab Spring arrived in 2011, carrying the extraordinary news that Zine El Abidine Ben Ali had fled Tunisia and that Hosni Mubarak had been pushed from his throne in Egypt, Mubarak, who had seemed as permanent as the pyramids, something shifted in the Syrian imagination. If they could fall, the whisper went, then perhaps anyone could fall. Back in Daraa, the protests were spreading before the authorities had decided what to do about them. More towns joined. Banias, Latakia, the suburbs of Damascus itself. The scenes were astonishing in their ordinariness. People marching, chanting, holding candles, demanding dignity and the release of political prisoners. Not yet calling for Bashar's removal. Not yet imagining, many of them, that this was revolution rather than a petition. They were wrong to think that restraint would protect them. The regime's response oscillated between confusion and brutality in a way that suggested it had never seriously planned for this possibility. At times the security forces fired live ammunition directly into crowds. At other times they made gestures toward compromise, promising reforms, releasing some prisoners, even canceling emergency law that had been in place since 1963. But every concession was paired with another massacre, and the massacres were louder than the promises. The protesters began to understand that they were not dealing with a government that had misjudged its response. They were dealing with a government that had decided its survival required violence, and was now implementing that decision. By April 2011, the army was being deployed to Syrian cities in a way it had not been deployed against Syrian civilians since the crushing of the Muslim Brotherhood in Hama in 1982. An event so brutal, so total, that a blanket of silence had been drawn over it for 3 decades. The soldiers who arrived in Daraa that April did not come to protect civilians. They came to occupy. They cut the phone lines. They set up checkpoints. They searched house to house for anyone suspected of organizing the protests. Some of what they found in those houses, weapons they said, foreign conspirators, armed gangs, was almost certainly fabricated. Some of it was not. Because this is the thing about crackdowns, they create what they are meant to prevent. Every family that watched a son dragged away, every neighborhood that buried a protest martyr, every young man who concluded that peaceful demonstration was a path to a detention cell, each of these became a recruiting moment for something harder and angrier than candlelit vigils. But this was only the beginning. The transformation from protest movement to armed insurgency did not happen overnight, and it did not happen uniformly across the country. It happened in increments, each one feeling to those living through it like a last resort, a necessary escalation, an act of survival rather than aggression. Soldiers began to defect, not dozens, but eventually hundreds, then thousands. Many of them were Sunni Muslims who found themselves ordered to fire on Sunni Muslim protesters and could not do it. Some defected openly, broadcasting their refusals on shaky phone videos. Some simply melted away from their units and returned to their home villages and picked up weapons. In July 2011, a group of defected officers announced the formation of the Free Syrian Army. The name carried tremendous symbolic weight. Here was a military institution claiming legitimacy against the regime, but the reality was more fragmented, more chaotic. The FSA was never really an army in any conventional sense. It was an umbrella, an idea, a label that hundreds of separate local armed groups could attach to themselves without any central command dictating their tactics or their ideology. This would matter enormously later. But in those early months, it still felt, to many Syrians, to many observers, like the birth of a liberation movement. Across the border, watching with intense interest, were the governments of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. Each saw in Syria's turmoil something different, an opportunity to weaken Iran, a chance to spread their particular version of Sunni politics, a regional realignment that could shift the balance of power in their favor. Money began flowing in. Weapons began flowing in. Not yet in the quantities that would come later, but enough to signal that this conflict would not remain a domestic affair. And on the other side of the chessboard, in Tehran and Moscow, different calculations were being made. Iran's relationship with the Assad government was one of the most important strategic partnerships in the Middle East, built over 30 years on shared opposition to American influence and support for Hezbollah in Lebanon. The possibility of losing Syria, of having the land bridge between Tehran and Hezbollah severed, was, for Iranian leadership, an existential threat. Not to Iran itself, perhaps, but to Iran's entire regional project. Advisors arrived. Money arrived. And eventually, Iranian-backed militias would arrive. Russia's calculus was different, but equally urgent. Syria hosted Russia's only naval base in the Mediterranean, at Tartus. More broadly, Moscow had spent years watching NATO expand and Western-backed revolutions topple governments across what it considered its sphere of influence. In Georgia, in Ukraine, in the Arab world. Syria was a line that would not be crossed. Vladimir Putin would later say this explicitly. What he meant was that Russia would do whatever was necessary to prevent Assad's fall. And then the war changed again. By 2012, the violence had escalated beyond anything the early protesters had imagined when they spray-painted walls in Daraa. The regime had concluded that half measures were more dangerous than total force, and it began deploying its military in ways that blurred every distinction between combatant and civilian, between military target and populated neighborhood. Artillery was fired into residential areas. Helicopters dropped barrel bombs, oil drums packed with explosives and metal fragments, designed not for precision but for devastation, onto markets and hospitals and breadlines. The city of Homs became a symbol of what was being done and what was being lost. Homs was Syria's third largest city, a place of remarkable sectarian mixing where Sunni and Christian and Alawite neighborhoods had coexisted for generations in the particular way of old Syrian cities, not always harmoniously, but functionally, humanly. A journalist who had visited before the war described it as a city that felt like a conversation, always slightly on the verge of becoming an argument, but never quite getting there. By 2012, the conversation was over. The old city of Homs, the Baba Amr neighborhood, the souk, the labyrinthine streets where generations of families had lived above their workshops, became a battlefield in the most literal sense. Rebel fighters held the neighborhood. Government forces surrounded it. Snipers were positioned on rooftops, making movement across certain intersections a proposition that required running faster than a bullet, or waiting until darkness, or simply accepting the possibility that this moment might be the last one. Residents caught inside the siege had to make calculations that no one should ever have to make. Which house is safer? Which route through the rubble is less likely to be observed? How long can the food last? Is that sound shelling or thunder? The siege of Baba Amr lasted 3 weeks in early 2012. When government forces finally retook it, journalists who entered described a landscape of almost total destruction. Not a single building undamaged, the air still thick with dust and the smell of burning, photographs and furniture and children's toys visible through collapsed walls like cross-sections of interrupted lives. The survivors who had not fled were detained. The ones who had organized the defense were largely gone, dead or disappeared into the next phase of a conflict that was already reshaping itself into something new and more complex. Because while the world was watching Homs, something was happening in the eastern desert that most people weren't watching at all. Something that had been growing quietly in the confusion, feeding on the chaos, patient in the way that only the most dangerous things are patient. The border between Syria and Iraq had always been porous in ways that the maps didn't fully represent. Tribal connections, smuggling routes, family networks that crossed the line as naturally as water. When the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 shattered that country's Ba'athist state and unleashed sectarian violence on a catastrophic scale, a network emerged in the chaos. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which under Abu Musab al-Zarqawi pioneered a particular form of religious political violence that was more apocalyptic, more nihilistic, more indifferent to human life than almost anything that had come before it. Zarqawi was killed in 2006. His organization was nearly destroyed by 2010, hunted down by American forces and Iraqi tribes who had grown sick of its brutality. Nearly destroyed is not destroyed. The remnant of Al-Qaeda in Iraq was led, by 2010, by a man of remarkable obscurity named Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He was a scholar of Islamic law, from a tribal family near Samarra, who had spent time in an American detention camp called Camp Bucca, an experience that, according to those who knew him, had not rehabilitated but concentrated him. He was patient. He was methodical. And when Syria began to collapse in 2011, he understood immediately what the collapse meant. A failed state on Iraq's western border, full of weapons, full of desperate and angry young men, full of ungoverned territory where no authority existed to stop whatever came next. The organization that would become ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or Daesh in Arabic, did not announce itself. It arrived like a shadow arriving before a cloud. In 2012 and into 2013, fighters affiliated with Baghdadi's network began appearing in the Syrian conflict, initially fighting alongside rebel groups against the Assad regime, performing effectively on the battlefield, distributing food and establishing rough governance in areas the rebels had taken but couldn't administer. They were welcomed, at first, by communities exhausted by chaos and hungry for order. Questions about their ideology were set aside. Who had time for ideology when there were front lines to hold? But this was only the beginning. In Raqqa, a city on the Euphrates that rebel forces had taken from the government in March 2013 in the first major urban capture of the war, the shadow became concrete. ISIS, still formally called the Islamic State of Iraq at that point, moved in with a speed and organization that left the other rebel groups stunned. Within weeks, they had expelled the other factions from the city. They raised their black flag over the governor's compound. They established courts, police, a kind of order that was absolute and terrifying in equal measure. Public executions began. Music was banned. Women who appeared without full covering were beaten. Christians were given the choice of conversion, payment of a medieval tax called the jizya, or death. The city of Raqqa, which had been a place of provincial normalcy just 2 years before, became the capital of something that defied every category that international relations had developed for understanding armed groups. The rebel groups that had welcomed these fighters now found themselves confronting a monster they had helped feed. Attempts to drive ISIS out of Raqqa in 2013 and early 2014 failed. The organization was better armed, better funded, and governed by a discipline that was itself a weapon, because ISIS executed its own members for disobedience with the same indifference it executed enemies, and this certainty of consequence produced a kind of terrifying cohesion. Meanwhile, the flow of foreign fighters into Syria had become a river. Young men from across the Arab world, from Europe, from as far away as Australia and the United States, came seeking something: belonging, purpose, adventure, redemption, a chance to participate in what ISIS propaganda described as the fulfillment of ancient prophecy. ISIS was extraordinarily skilled at propaganda, at using social media in ways that no armed group had ever used it before, packaging mass murder with high production values and releasing it into the global information ecosystem like a virus engineered for a particular kind of susceptibility. And then, in June 2014, everything changed again. In a single week that June, ISIS forces swept out of eastern Syria and across the Iraqi border, capturing Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city, a city of nearly 2 million people, in a matter of days. The Iraqi army, which the United States had spent years and billions of dollars training and equipping, collapsed before them. Soldiers stripped off their uniforms and fled. ISIS captured entire armories of American military equipment, Humvees, artillery, weapons systems. They seized the Mosul Central Bank and took hundreds of millions of dollars in cash. And then, on June 29, 2014, in the Great Mosque of Al-Nuri in Mosul, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi appeared in person for the first time and declared the establishment of a caliphate, an Islamic state, stretching across a territory larger than the United Kingdom, containing millions of people under its control. The world had not seen anything quite like this before. Not Al-Qaeda, which had been a terrorist network, a ghost that struck from the shadows. This was something that controlled territory, administered a population, collected taxes, ran courts, maintained infrastructure, a shadow state that had metastasized into the real thing. And at its heart, at its point of origin, was Syria. Broken, burning, consumed by multiple overlapping wars within a war. How did it get this far? The question echoed through foreign ministries and think tanks and UN offices. The honest answer was that it got this far because of everything. Because of Bashar al-Assad's decision to use maximum force against protesters, because of the flood of weapons and money from regional powers that extended and complicated the conflict without resolving it, because of the failure of international diplomacy, caught between Russian vetoes in the Security Council and American reluctance to intervene directly, because of the particular chemistry of despair and ideology that ISIS knew how to exploit, because chaos, once created, has its own momentum, its own terrible logic. If Homs was the symbol of what the war was doing to Syria's past, Aleppo was the symbol of what it was doing to Syria's future. Syria's largest city, its commercial capital, its great trading metropolis that had connected the Silk Road to the Mediterranean for millennia, Aleppo became, from 2012 to 2016, the most intensely contested urban battlefield in the world. The division of Aleppo was almost surgical in its cruelty. Government forces held the western parts of the city, rebels held the east. The front line ran through neighborhoods, through apartment buildings, sometimes through individual floors of individual buildings. Life in both halves continued in the surreal way that life always continues even inside war. People went to work, children were sent to school when schools existed, bread was bought and eaten. But the sniper fire never stopped, and the shelling never stopped, and slowly, inexorably, the city was being eaten from within. A doctor who worked in a field hospital in East Aleppo described receiving patients in waves, each wave corresponding to a strike somewhere in the city. He described learning to read the type of injury: blast wounds from artillery, burns from incendiary weapons, the particular damage done by cluster munitions. He described teaching young men with no medical training to perform procedures that properly required years of study, because there was no one else. He described a morning when a child was brought in who had lost both legs to a bomb, and who looked up at him with an expression of such complete bewilderment. Not pain, or not yet pain, just bewilderment, the shock of a child encountering something for which childhood has no category, that he had to step outside for a moment before he could continue working. Above Aleppo, and above Homs, and above Daraa, and above 100 smaller towns, the Syrian Air Force flew. They flew barrel bombs. They flew missiles. After Russia entered the war directly in September 2015, Russian aircraft flew alongside them, with far greater precision and far greater range. The Russian intervention was framed as a campaign against terrorism, against ISIS, but the overwhelming majority of Russian strikes in the first months fell not on ISIS positions but on rebel-held areas in western Syria, in places like Idlib and Homs and Aleppo. This was not a misunderstanding. This was the campaign: support Assad, restore the regime's control, prevent the fall of a government that Russia had decided, for strategic reasons, could not be allowed to fall. The American position was the mirror image of this. And the mirror image of a contradiction is still a contradiction. The United States supported the removal of Assad in principle, but was unwilling to intervene militarily in ways that might directly confront Russian forces. The United States wanted to fight ISIS but needed local ground forces to do it, and the local ground forces it found were the Syrian Kurds, the YPG, which created enormous tensions with Turkey, a NATO ally, which regarded the Syrian Kurdish forces as an extension of the PKK, a group Turkey considered a terrorist organization. Every decision created a new problem. Every alliance generated a new enemy. The war had become a space where every actor's interests conflicted with every other actor's interests, and the people of Syria were caught in the intersections. But no one saw what was coming next. The battle for Aleppo reached its climax in the final months of 2016. Government forces, backed by Iranian-commanded militias and Russian air power, tightened their siege of the rebel-held east. The supply routes were cut. Food ran out. Medicine ran out. The hospitals, already bombed repeatedly, in what human rights organizations described as deliberate targeting, ran out of everything except patients. Doctors performed operations without anesthesia. People ate grass and leather. And the world watched through the eyes of a handful of journalists and residents who remained inside and used whatever connectivity they could find to broadcast what was happening. There was a 7-year-old girl named Bana Alabed who tweeted from East Aleppo with her mother's help, her messages to the world heartbreaking in their simplicity and their specificity. "I am very scared. The bombing is so heavy. Goodbye, world." The tweets were read by millions of people who could do nothing but read them, and this combination, the visibility and the powerlessness, became a particular form of modern anguish. The war in Syria taught the world something terrible about the limits of witnessing, about the distance between seeing suffering and stopping it. In December 2016, East Aleppo fell. The evacuation, negotiated under intense international pressure, moved tens of thousands of civilians and rebel fighters from the city in green buses, a procession of defeat that stretched for miles. People carried what they could: a bag of clothes, a child, a photograph. The city they were leaving had been, 5 years before, one of the great cities of the Middle East. What remained was a landscape that looked like an archaeological site, ruins upon ruins, layer upon layer of destruction. Aleppo was retaken, but there was nothing to celebrate in what had been done to it. By 2017, the shape of the Syrian war had become something different from what it had been in 2011, or 2013, or even 2015. The regime had survived. Assad, who Western leaders had pronounced doomed in the early years of the conflict, was still in his palace, still in power. The FSA, the Free Syrian Army, was fragmented, discredited, exhausted, many of its fighters absorbed by Islamist factions more effective on the battlefield. ISIS, the monster that had emerged from the chaos, was under military pressure from multiple directions. American-backed Syrian Kurdish forces from the north, Iraqi forces from the east, even the Syrian government from the west. The territorial caliphate was contracting. But contracting is not disappearing. And the war was not ending. It was transforming. The battle for Raqqa, ISIS's self-proclaimed capital, lasted from June to October 2017. American-backed forces, predominantly Syrian Kurdish, fought their way through the city block by block, house by house, tunnel by tunnel. ISIS had prepared the city for siege, booby-trapped buildings, underground networks, fighters willing to die and trained to kill as they died. When the city was finally declared liberated, 70 to 80% of it had been destroyed. The people who returned found a city that was technically free and physically uninhabitable. Water systems destroyed. Electricity gone. Hospitals gone. Schools gone. The rubble stretched as far as the eye could follow. And in Mosul, the other capital of the caliphate, the final battle was even more devastating. 9 months of urban combat, some of the most intense since World War II. The old city, a UNESCO heritage site, a labyrinth of medieval streets that had survived Mongol invasions and Ottoman rule, was almost entirely obliterated. Civilian casualties numbered in the thousands. The numbers were disputed, as numbers always are in war, but the physical evidence was not. Satellite imagery showed the old city as a moonscape, a uniform gray field where a living neighborhood had been. ISIS was not destroyed. It went underground. Its fighters dispersed into sleeper cells, into ungoverned desert spaces, into neighboring countries. Its ideology, available online, self-replicating, requiring no central structure to survive, continued to inspire attacks across the world. In Paris, in Brussels, in London, in Istanbul, in Kabul. The territorial caliphate had been dismantled. The idea of the caliphate was still alive, and would remain alive, metastasizing into new contexts, adapting to new defeats, finding new grievances to inhabit. But in Syria, something more immediate was unfolding than the question of ISIS's long-term survival. The question of what would come after the war, the question of reconstruction, of accountability, of whether the country destroyed could be rebuilt, and whether it could be rebuilt into something that would not simply generate the next cycle of violence, was beginning, tentatively, to be asked. And the answers were deeply, deeply troubling. No one can give you a single number for what Syria lost. The numbers that do exist are staggering and insufficient at the same time. More than 500,000 people killed, though some estimates are higher, in a country that had 22 million people when the war began. More than half the pre-war population displaced, either internally within Syria or as refugees in neighboring countries and beyond. Lebanon, a country of 4 million, absorbed more than 1 million Syrian refugees, the highest per capita refugee burden of any country on earth. Jordan absorbed hundreds of thousands. Turkey, whose own relationship with the conflict was complex and sometimes violent, hosted more than 3 million. And then, in 2015, the river of displacement reached Europe. 1 million people crossing the Mediterranean in a single year, in rubber dinghies and fishing boats, many of them drowning in sight of shores they had hoped would offer safety. The image that crystallized the refugee crisis, that forced the world to feel, if only for a moment, what the statistics could not convey, was the photograph of Alan Kurdi. 3 years old. Kurdish Syrian. Found drowned on a beach in Turkey in September 2015, lying face down in the sand in a red t-shirt, as if he had simply fallen asleep. His father had paid a smuggler to take the family across to the Greek island of Kos. The boat had capsized within minutes of leaving shore. Alan's mother and brother also died. His father survived and spent the rest of his life trying to explain what had happened and why. The children of Syria. This is the thread that, once you pull it, unravels something vast and awful. By some estimates, more than 2 million Syrian children were out of school during the peak years of the conflict. An entire generation growing up in refugee camps, in damaged cities, in countries that were not their own, learning, or failing to learn, or learning the wrong things, under conditions no education system was designed for. Psychologists who worked with Syrian children described what they found: children who could not sleep, who flinched at loud sounds, who had drawings of violence when asked to draw their families, who had developed a particular learned helplessness, a conviction that nothing they did had any effect on what happened to them, that the world was a place of arbitrary catastrophe beyond any individual's control. This is not a wound that heals in a year or a decade. This is a wound that shapes lives, and the lives those lives produce, for generations. Inside Syria, for those who remained or returned, the aftermath of the war was not peace but a kind of suspended devastation. The regime had retaken most of the country's populated areas, but retaking them had not healed them. Whole neighborhoods in Homs, in Aleppo, in Deir-ez-Zor remained uninhabitable years after the fighting stopped. The government announced reconstruction plans, but the money was never there. Syria's economy had contracted by more than 60% during the war, sanctions made international investment nearly impossible, and the corruption that had always plagued the state now operated in overdrive in a country with too few institutions left to check it. People who returned to their homes sometimes found that their homes had been given to someone else. The regime passed laws allowing the seizure of property from those who had fled, or from those deemed to have supported the opposition, and the application of these laws was frequently opaque and frequently corrupt and frequently targeted at Sunni Muslim families in areas that the regime wanted to demographically reshape. The phrase that human rights organizations used for this was demographic engineering, and the evidence for it was substantial enough that it drew comparison to historical processes in other parts of the world that the world had said, after experiencing them, never again. For those in the northwest of the country, in Idlib province, the last major rebel-held area, the war was still not over. More than 3 million people were crowded into a region that had been receiving displaced people from every other part of Syria for years, each military campaign in the south or east producing another wave of displacement northward, always northward, until Idlib had become a pressure vessel of unimaginable human density. The regime and its allies launched periodic military operations against it, each one producing new waves of displacement toward a Turkish border that was increasingly, desperately closed. Hundreds of thousands of people lived in camps that had become semi-permanent, in white tents visible from satellite, cities of the dispossessed that had their own names and their own internal geographies and their own forms of social organization because human beings, given no choice, make community wherever they are. And in the northeast, the American-backed Syrian Kurdish forces held a stretch of territory that was a kind of autonomous zone, neither part of the Assad government's Syria nor internationally recognized as anything else, a political liminal space maintained by American military presence that was always described as temporary and never quite ended. The Kurds who administered it had their own courts, their own police, their own educational system that taught a version of Syrian history that differed markedly from the official version. They held thousands of ISIS prisoners in facilities that were inadequate for the numbers and deeply concerning to human rights observers. They waited, in the uneasy way of people who have power but no permanent status, for the next turn of a conflict that had demonstrated its capacity for surprise over and over again. The international dimension of the Syrian war had by this point become so entangled, so layered with competing interests and contradictory alliances, that it resisted easy summary. Russia had achieved its strategic objective, Assad survived, the Russian naval base at Tartus was secure, and Moscow had demonstrated to the world that it could project military power in the Middle East and face no serious consequences for doing so. Iran had maintained its land bridge to Hezbollah. Turkey had intervened militarily in northern Syria, establishing buffer zones and proxy administrations that it justified as counter-terrorism against the Kurds, but that also served to prevent the emergence of a Kurdish state on its border. Israel had conducted hundreds of airstrikes inside Syria against Iranian weapons shipments and Hezbollah positions, operating in a kind of permanent shadow war that was acknowledged but never quite formally addressed. The United States remained present but strategically uncertain, conducting counter-terrorism operations while declining to take any definitive position on the political future of the country. None of these actors had an interest in Syria's reconstruction. None of them had an interest in accountability for what had been done. And the mechanisms of international accountability, the International Criminal Court, the United Nations, were blocked by the same Russian veto that had blocked every Security Council resolution on Syria throughout the war. A UN commission of inquiry documented war crimes by virtually every party to the conflict. The documentation accumulated in filing cabinets. Justice, for the Syrian people, remained a language without a word for now. And then the war changed again. What happened in Syria in late 2024 was something that analysts and intelligence agencies had not predicted with any confidence, something that added another impossible layer to an already impossible story. In a matter of days in early December, rebel forces led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, an organization with its own complicated genealogy, descended from al-Qaeda's Syrian branch but having formally renounced that affiliation, swept out of Idlib and captured Aleppo, then Hama, then Homs, then advanced on Damascus itself. The Syrian army, which had seemed so firmly in control just months before, collapsed with a speed that mirrored the collapse of the Iraqi army before ISIS a decade earlier. And Bashar al-Assad, the man who had survived every prediction of his downfall, who had outlasted 4 American presidents and a decade of sanctions and the destruction of his own country, fled. He flew to Russia, where he was granted asylum, and the government that his father had built and that had drenched Syria in blood to survive for more than 50 years simply ceased to exist in the space of 11 days. The scenes from Damascus in those first days were extraordinary and deeply strange. Crowds entered the presidential palace and moved through its rooms with a mixture of fury and bewilderment, taking photographs of the chandeliers and the swimming pools and the private quarters of a man who had proclaimed himself the defender of Syria while impoverishing and destroying it. Political prisoners, held in the regime's prisons for years or decades, walked out into a sunlight they had not expected to see again. Some of them could barely walk. Some of them had been reported as dead. The reunions at prison gates, children meeting parents who had been taken when they were young, siblings who had grown old waiting, were among the most devastating things to emerge from a conflict that had produced nothing but devastating things. But the extraordinary was immediately complicated by the urgent, as it always is. Who was in charge now? What would replace the Assad government? The rebel coalition that had taken the country was ideologically complex and internally contradictory, dominated by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, an organization with a jihadist history that had made explicit promises of tolerance and pluralism that many Syrians, particularly minorities, were not ready to believe. The presence of Turkish-backed factions. The presence of other factions with other agendas. The Kurdish forces in the northeast who had not been part of the rebel advance and who now faced an uncertain relationship with whoever would govern the country. The remnants of ISIS cells still operating in the desert. The question of reconstruction that had no obvious answer. The question of the Syrian diaspora, millions of people scattered across the world who wanted to know if it was safe to come home, and who could not yet be given a confident answer. Syria had been liberated from one set of chains. Whether it was free was a different question entirely. There is a particular kind of silence that comes after a long war. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of exhaustion, of disorientation, of a population that has been through something so total that ordinary language has been strained to its limits and sometimes past them. It is the silence of a man sitting in the ruins of his house, unable to explain to anyone what it felt like to watch his street become a front line, and then to come back and find that the street no longer exists. It is the silence of a woman in a refugee camp in Jordan who has been there for 10 years and whose children now speak Arabic with a Jordanian accent and who cannot clearly remember what her house smelled like. It is the silence of a former soldier who defected from the Syrian army in 2012 and fought for a rebel group and watched that group fragment and be absorbed by factions he didn't believe in, and who now lives in a European city where no one quite understands who he is or what he did. Syria. A word that, in 2011, most people in the world could locate on a map only approximately and knew only vaguely. A word that, by 2015, had become shorthand for a category of catastrophe. The kind of catastrophe that happens when everything that can go wrong goes wrong at the same time. When internal pressures and external interventions and historical grievances and geopolitical calculations all arrive at the same place simultaneously and produce something that no single cause can explain and no single actor can claim to have either intended or been able to stop. What did those people want? The ones who first marched in Daraa, who held candles outside Al-Amari Mosque, who spray-painted walls. They wanted what people almost everywhere want. Dignity. Accountability. The right to live without fear of a knock on the door at 3 in the morning. the right to speak without calculating the consequences of every word. These were not revolutionary demands. They were ordinary demands. They became revolutionary only because the state that received them had no mechanism for response except violence. And violence, once unleashed at that scale, does not stay within the limits of its original purpose. It spreads. It deepens. It makes its own logic and follows its own logic and eventually produces outcomes that no one planned and that everyone contributed to and for which no one is held accountable. 500,000 people. Say that number slowly. 500,000 people. More than half the population displaced. Cities that took millennia to build, reduced to rubble in months. A generation of children growing up without the childhoods they were owed. A diaspora scattered across 40 countries, carrying Syria with them in memory and language and food, and the particular grief of people who have lost not just a home but the world that surrounded the home, the neighbors, the streets, the specific quality of evening light in a city they may never see again. And the questions that remain. Who will be accountable for what was done? Not in some abstract international legal sense, but in the actual human sense. Will the men who ordered barrel bombs dropped on hospitals ever face justice? Will the men who built the torture chambers ever answer for them? History offers no guarantee. The record suggests that impunity is more common than accountability, that the powerful who commit the largest crimes are often the last to face consequences, if they face them at all. Will Syria be rebuilt? With what money? Under what governance? With what guarantee that what is built will not simply recreate the conditions, the authoritarianism, the corruption, the exclusion, that produced the catastrophe in the first place? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that Syrians are actually asking, in Damascus and Idlib and Beirut and Berlin and Istanbul and Houston, right now, wherever they are, wherever the war sent them. The Syrian war taught the world, or should have taught the world, something about the fragility of the ordinary. About how quickly the texture of daily life, the fig vendor's cart, the schoolboy's football, the old man and his pigeons, can be transformed into something unrecognizable. About how the mechanisms that are supposed to prevent catastrophe, international law, diplomacy, the moral pressure of global opinion, can be blocked, circumvented, ignored, outpaced by the speed of violence once it begins. About how a country can be broken not in a single blow but in 10,000 incremental decisions, each one seeming necessary to someone, and how the sum of those decisions can add up to a devastation that no one chose and that everyone helped create. Syria is not finished. That is the final, unsettling, true thing to say about it. The violence may have subsided. The territorial map may have shifted. But the fractures remain, between communities, between regions, between the Syrians who stayed and the Syrians who left, and the Syrians who fought on one side and the Syrians who fought on the other, and the Syrians who didn't fight at all and tried simply to survive and succeeded or didn't. The trauma is in the ground of the country, in the literal ground, in the unexploded ordnance, in the mass graves, in the buildings that look intact from the front and are hollow from within, and it is in the people. A nation does not recover from this in a generation. It carries it forward, in the way that all peoples carry their catastrophes forward, transformed by them, shaped by them, sometimes defined by them, and always, still looking for the answer to the question that the teenagers in Daraa asked when they picked up their spray cans in February 2011. The question was not really about the regime. The question was about the future. The question was, what kind of country do we want to be?